Yeah, as Camilla said, I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I specialize in trauma, and more recently I started working with couples. And I think being able to have that experience, I've seen a significant overlap between kind of these two fields. And so I've been very passionate about talking about the way trauma shows up in relationships, and talking about how relationships are a really important thing to address when we're looking at trauma. And so kind of a lot of where this presentation comes from is combining these two pieces. I know professionally and personally, the quality of our life really is directly impacted by the quality of our relationships. And so the more I've been learning about the psychology of relationships, I just feel really passionate about getting that information out there, having more accessible educational resources for couples who are struggling. I know not everybody can afford couples therapy, and so I'm really trying to break this down, make it as digestible as possible, and hopefully something you can apply to your relationship now. Earlier this year, I was able to give a presentation on kind of interventions couples can use, looking at how to address conflict, ways to strengthen relationships. I'm not going to be going into interventions necessarily today, but I will be talking about what I consider to be one of the biggest threats in relationships, and I'm hoping to kind of break it down step by step, where it's kind of clear how you can maybe address each of those and how each of those steps is reversible. And then I think, I'm assuming aside from maybe the clinicians who are listening today, people who are here maybe have experienced a betrayal like infidelity, or maybe they're looking for ways to prevent this. So I'm hoping you can learn something and apply it. If you're to the point where the damage is done, then I really want to help you just feel confident in your ability to heal by looking at the effects of the betrayal from a trauma perspective, and hopefully being able to point you in the direction where you're able to get the support that you need to heal the relationship and to heal yourself. My background is, like Camilla said, in couples therapy and the Gottman method. And so I am not reinventing the wheel here. If you're a Gottman therapist, a lot of this might be familiar to you. If you've read a lot of the Gottman's research, there might not be a lot of new things in this presentation for you. I will also be bringing in a lot of work by Sue Johnson and Shirley Glass, and I'll have a slide of all my references at the end in case you're interested in learning more about that. But again, like I said, my goal here is just to make the research and interesting training that I've been able to do in the past year available and digestible, and of course, being able to tie that into my trauma background. So here's kind of the brief overview. Let's see, of what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to be moving kind of quickly because I definitely want to make sure there's time for questions at the end. So let's start with monogamy. I think it's interesting all the different types of relationship styles there are now, but monogamy has a really interesting place in our history. I think the first several million years, we really kind of look at our hominid ancestors and what was going on for them. You know, they were able to invent fire and they learned how to use tools. Pretty early on, we see kind of meaning being derived, seeing religious rituals for things like honoring the dead or celebrations that come up and festivals that come up. And I think what's interesting is, you know, the brain during this time was less than half the size that it is now. And so as we've evolved, the brain's become larger, and this has kind of required a much longer period of time in which children need sort of intensive care. So I think we kind of started off with investing a lot, or investing very little in a lot of offspring, and now we're kind of seeing the shift about 20 to 40,000 years ago, or now we're looking at investing more and less offspring. And so before, in our kind of hunter-gatherer ancestors, you know, there was this collective parenting that takes place. There would be a baby that's born, and it might not be the biological mother or father that's raising it, kind of gets passed around. And so really, as the brain's taking longer to develop, we're now seeing a different reproductive strategy, which is monogamy. Anthropologists tell us there are kind of three main types of monogamy. Got social, reproductive, and sexual. Social is really, you're just spending all of your time exclusively with a partner. Reproductive is you're reproducing with one partner. Sexual is just being sexually active with one partner. And so I think what's interesting is how this is, each of these has evolved over time. And we have kind of evolved into a pretty monogamous species. I think if you look at the social aspect of that, the United Nations say about almost 90% of humans are married by the age of 49. So social monogamy really is kind of true of our species. We really like having that one person. We like having a major confidant who's also our activity person. That tends to be the majority. Then when we look at reproductive monogamy, we've looked at a number of studies in all types of cultures, looking at extra paternity, and we're really finding that over 90% of the time we're reproducing with one partner. And more we're seeing that in kind of first world countries where there's this sort of serial genetic monogamy. And then when we move into sexual monogamy, the stats go down a little bit. We don't really know exactly what the stats are, but around 20% for men, 15% for women when we're looking at infidelity. This is lifetime incidence of infidelity. So even with that, there's still a good 80 to 85% of the time we're sexually monogamous. So why? What is the advantage of being socially and sexually monogamous? So I think the title of the slide is misleading. This is the advantages of monogamy in a healthy relationship. So I kind of wanted to point that out. When we're looking at what goes into quality of life, what goes into healthy lifestyles, there's this kind of recent or relatively new field, social epidemiology, that's really interested in figuring out what makes a healthy, high quality life, what determines longevity, kind of more looking at first world countries where basic needs are being met. And what they found is it's not what you eat, it's not physical activity, the type of exercise you're doing. They found that it's the quality of our closest relationships that matter. And those advantages are enormous. You live longer. You live longer if your relationships with people are better. And that's not necessarily intimate romantic relationships, or friendships, familial relationships. And I find that so fascinating. There are so many benefits. And I think we're only just starting to really understand how important the role healthy relationships play, and not just mental health, but in all of aspects of life. I think especially for clinicians who are listening, you're probably aware of a lot of really alarming research being done on loneliness, kind of the opposite of that, and how that is probably one of the most significantly contributing factors when we're looking at mental health concerns today. We're seeing a lot of that, high prevalence in younger generations. We've never been more connected as a society, yet the loneliness is just, it's off the charts. And we're seeing how that plays out in a lot of different ways. That's really affecting so many aspects of mental health. But then we're seeing also that those who experience loneliness die younger. And it tends to be men, because women tend to have better support systems, although I feel like that is starting to change. But yeah, I feel like this very first one, when we're looking at relationships, that's a really important piece. Then, of course, you stay healthier physically, stronger immune systems, the likelihood of becoming wealthier. There's some interesting studies, research done at the University of Virginia, where they've studied these types of relationships. They found that children tend to do infinitely better when there are two parents in a committed relationship rather than just one or none. And what I think also is really interesting is the very last one listed here. The mechanism for these gains has been documented by some incredible research done with fMRIs. We're really trying to figure out, so far, everything on this list, we're looking at correlation here. But if we were really to break down what's happening in the brain when you are in a committed relationship, in a healthy and happy relationship, it's pretty crazy what we're finding. The Gottmans love referencing this one particular study where they had participants hooked up to fMRIs, so you're able to kind of get an idea of what's happening in real time in the brain. and giving an electrical shock to the big toe of the participant. And they did a study where they're holding the hand of their partner, hand of a stranger, and then not holding any hands at all. And what they found is that if you are in a happy relationship and you're holding your partner's hand, that entire fear system in the brain shuts down, even in kind of this adversive situation. And what is even crazier to me is that they took the study a step further and involved Shirley Glass in this. And they repeated the same study with couples that were going into couples therapy and couples who'd undergone couples therapy. I think they were in emotionally focused therapy, so EFT. And what they found is that those who were just beginning, so those who were experiencing distress in the relationship, when they got those shocks to their big toe, if they were holding their partner's hands, not only did that not dampen their fear system, it was actually more activated than when they were holding the hand of a stranger. I don't know why that is just so shocking to me. You know, we talk about the power of relationships and the power of being that support to a partner, or having a partner that's supportive. You know, you're just tapping into a lot of really important things with that. And of course, they did the study with the couples who'd undergone couples therapy or describing much happier relationships, and then that was reversed. They got that kind of dampening stress or fear response. So let's talk about, so now we know benefits of monogamy, having a strong, healthy relationship. So before we go into kind of what threatens a healthy relationship, let's take a look at actually what's going into a healthy relationship. A lot of interesting research behind kind of these different phases that we move through in committed monogamous relationships. I think we're all familiar with phase one, that falling in love, honeymoon phase. And then when we are able to move past that into phases 2 and 3, that's where we start to see things become real. And if there's a potential to kind of break apart that trust, if there's that potential for a betrayal to start, we're going to kind of see that in an overlap between phases 2 and 3. So let's start with the first phase. I think we're all familiar with the sensation of falling in love, this honeymoon phase. I think it's probably the most documented human experience ever. So many stories and songs, and you know, I think if you've been in an experience where you fall in love, you just know so many crazy things are happening. And what I think is interesting is it's a highly selective phase. So not just anyone can set this off. You have to be compatible on so many levels, and some of those levels aren't even measurable. You gotta smell right, taste right, feel right, be just right to talk to. And when that happens, those physiological changes in this phase are insane. I couldn't fit everything onto this slide, so I'm just gonna kind of move through, but we are just flooded with all the feel-good chemicals. Neurotransmitters, hormones, DHEA feels like you're high, PEA spikes. I think we see that with ovulation in women, so it's kind of that magnetic pull. Pheromones make you feel like you're intoxicated. So smell matters a lot. Oxytocin is probably the most interesting hormone, at least to me. It's kind of that hormone of touch, of cuddling. It's secreted with orgasm when a woman is giving birth. It really kind of calms that fear center of the brain. It's the bonding hormone. And tons of interesting research behind oxytocin. We see that it reduces good judgment when you're flooded with it. Also interesting is oxytocin's kind of the monogamous hormone. They've injected that in rodents that aren't monogamous and seen that they end up mating with just one other rodent. And then kind of the flip side of that is vasopressin, which is just in men, and it's kind of also a hormone of monogamy. It's more of that possessive jealousy. And I'm not saying jealousy necessarily in a bad way, kind of that healthy jealousy. So that connection, that possessiveness. We get estrogen, which is responsible for softness and receptivity, testosterone, that sexual desire and lust. Progesterone, which is sort of that sedating, calming feeling, prolactin, which reduces aggression, increases nurturance, serotonin, which helps kind of lower irritability. There's more emotional sensitivity when you're experiencing more serotonin, and then dopamine. And I think dopamine is that excitement, that anticipation of reward. Helps you feel pleasurable, makes you take risks. It's that feeling that something amazing is about to happen. So again, we're getting flooded with all the good stuff here. So phase one is a really, really important part to kind of start to bond with a partner. And then what happens when the brunt of those chemicals start to wear off? We move to phase two. And by the way, these chemicals are still there. We're still experiencing these. They're just kind of almost dampened a bit. So blinders are off, kind of left to see what's really there. And you get to decide in this phase, are you in or are you out? This is really where trust starts to build. I want to know, will you be there for me? If I am experiencing difficulties at work, are you going to be a support? Financial distress, am I on my own? If I'm sick, will you care for me? If we fight, is it worth the effort to address that fight? Trust is really being built by being there, by repairing, by having miscommunication. Conflict is inevitable, and it's a really, really important piece to see. Is there trust? Negative emotions, are really an important factor here. It really gives us a clue into our partner's internal world, and we can learn a lot if we're able to actually process that negativity and not just run away from it or shut down from it. So really being able to see what the repair ends up looking like in this stage. And then of course, attunement. You can't do any of these things if you're not attuned to your partner, and really being able to pay attention to that. And so trust is a huge part of a healthy relationship, and it builds. It's not something that happens overnight. And we have opportunities to do this all the time, to kind of build to this trust account. And big things like saying things that are hard to say, but even in the little ways. If you are on your way out to do an activity that you just really enjoy doing, and you pass your partner and it's clear that he or she is upset, you have an opportunity right then to maybe put things on hold and to check in. It requires attunement, so paying attention to registering maybe upset on their face, and then what you choose to do with that, how you show up. And so even just those little opportunities go a long way. And then that moves us into phase three. And phase three is all about commitment. Are you committed? Are you loyal to me? Will you betray me? And we're really kind of being able to pick one or the other at this point. Loyalty really is built by cherishing what you have. It's sort of nurturing gratitude for this person that you're in a relationship with, as opposed to making negative comparisons, cultivating resentment, hyper-focusing on what's missing. So much of this comes down to perspective. In fact, I would argue so much of mental health in general comes down to perspective, especially when we're looking at this culture, this atmosphere in a relationship. When you cherish what you have, you wind up investing more and more in that relationship. You give more of yourself, you sacrifice, you're constantly thinking, you feel lucky to have this person in your life. They're irreplaceable. Phase three is all, we kind of get this idea of never put your eggs in one basket. That's not what phase three is about. It's putting all your eggs in this basket. It's being able to invest, not holding back. You can't really hold back in a relationship and master all three of these phases. And I think the beautiful part about this is when things work out in all three phases, the evidence shows you can stay in love over the course of a lifetime. So this is not just you can love your partner, but you can be in love with your partner. phase one is still there. You're still feeling those things. A lot of fun research, again, with fMRIs. Helen Fisher did a bunch of studies where she had people looking at just photos of their loved ones. And what they found is this whole septal part of the brain just lit up. You know, we're still having that kind of same reaction that you would see in phase one. And that could happen a year in, that could happen decades in. And so I think that when we talk about healthy relationships, it's really important to kind of see what this looks like when all three of these phases work out. And there's no shelf life, no expiration date. The key is you have to be able to work through all three of these phases. So now we know what love looks like. We know that our partner, our relationship can be a safe haven when there's trust, there's commitment, there's physiological calm. Now let's talk about what happens when it's shattered. And before we get into this kind of cascade effect, which is kind of, in my mind, the crux of this presentation, I just wanted to get on the same page with some terminology here. I'm kind of using infidelity and affairs interchangeably. I think it doesn't matter what word you want to use. What I am talking about is a physical or emotional liaison that violates the agreed upon terms of a relationship, poses a threat to the primary relationship, regardless of its length, regardless of the meaning, why it happened. It's violating the agreed upon terms of a relationship. And that is not a one size fits all. Many different types of relationships out there, many different ways that a line can be crossed. And I've seen that show up with couples. You know, it looks different for everybody. And so regardless, it's violating kind of these agreed upon terms. And so that's kind of how I'm using infidelity. And I just wanted to throw some stats out there about this. I think a lot of times infidelity isn't about sex. It's coming down to loneliness. It's coming down to needs that aren't really being met, and that partner doesn't know a mature or healthy way of getting those needs met in the relationship. If we look at the numbers, only about 11% of affairs turn into relationships, and even then, only about about 3/4 of those relationships don't even last. So there's a really high breakup or divorce rate, and the most common reason for the divorce, ironically, ends up being mistrust. So how does this happen? How do we go from this beautiful phase one where we're feeling everything amazing about the human experience to all of a sudden going outside of our relationship? Well, it doesn't just happen overnight. There is almost a very slow glacial cascade, step by step, that happens that leads towards a betrayal like infidelity. And this is, I'm quoting directly Gottman, who is quoting Rusbult, who is quoting Shirley Glass. Again, I am just taking what I have learned and trying to break it down in a way where I think what's interesting about this cascade is it's a step-by-step process, and no matter where you are in this process, you can stop it. And what it comes down to is there is an avoidance that happens. There's an avoidance of conflict and an avoidance of transparency. So kind of seeing we're not fighting anymore, and we're keeping secrets. You know, phases 1, 2, and 3 are all about kind of merging these bubbles. You know, we kind of come from different places and we're merging these two lifestyles together. And what happens is those start to separate. You start to live in your own bubble. And it really comes down to this sort of avoidance piece. So I'll circle back to that in a second. But really, it's people aren't telling each other what they need. And sorry for the cluttered slide, but I wanted to kind of go over all of this, and I want you to be able to kind of reference where this might fall in each of these columns. But really, as humans, universally, we all need a certain amount of attention, affection, admiration, or approval. These are basic needs that we get met socially. If you're not in a romantic relationship, then you've kind of been able to maybe put eggs in different baskets and kind of getting these needs met. When you're in a relationship and you're used to having these needs met with your partner, and all of a sudden you're not, there's the strain, there's the pressure that's put on that relationship. And then all of a sudden things start to happen. And it can start off very, very small. So I want to start with this first column, the attention piece. Constantly with attunement, we're looking for ways to connect with our partner. And we might be looking to connect in big ways or small ways. On a road trip and you pass an interesting billboard and you mention that, does your partner respond to that verbally or non-verbally? And what they found, I think, really interesting with the Gottman research is they've studied so many couples longitudinally, trying to figure out what's working in these relationships that are successful versus the ones that aren't successful. And that's actually a really important factor that's come up consistently, is in those successful relationships, 86% of the time, if you are trying to get your partner's attention, no matter how small, your partner is responding. In the relationships that were headed towards divorce or breakup, it was like 33%. So as simple as that sounds, that's a really important piece. And that could be a starting point of that. You're just not responding. So then, of course, what happens is you turn away. Why would you keep on making a bid for attention if it's not being reciprocated? And then, of course, we see negative affect starts to happen at this point. Negative comparisons, feeling like my partner's not there for me. Even small amounts of bidding for attention, all of a sudden are then creating a stress response in the partner, which can lead to physiological arousal or this flooding piece. And I think that's a really important factor here, is the minute you start to notice this flooding response, and again, this is a measurable thing. Your fight or flight is activated. You are feeling this physiological arousal, and it's almost like it's conditioning the relationship to be the threat. So now all of a sudden we're seeing your partner, you're seeing the relationship as a threat. And nothing good comes if you're trying to have a fight and a partner is flooded. So I want to say, if you're going to reverse that step, if that's where you are in this cascade effect, being able to recognize when you're feeling flooded and communicating that to your partner, or recognizing your partner's signs of that. You know, we all have tells of when we're feeling that way. It might not be super obvious, like somebody who's having a panic attack, but if you are tuned in to your partner's experience, and hopefully you are, being able to recognize that and then calling a timeout, because any continuation of a fight at that time is just going to make things worse. Again, it's going to kind of reinforce this relationship as a threat piece. So all of a sudden, a lot of negativity is happening. It becomes almost like an absorbing state. So when we turn to negativity, we have a lot of difficulty getting out of that. We don't know how to repair it when it starts to build up. It's just like this mound that keeps on getting bigger, and it requires so much more effort. Our response to that is really to kind of pull away. We want to become protective. Our emotional bank accounts feel pretty depleted at this point. We're avoiding conflict because it's too unpleasant. It feels futile. And then there's this kind of negative spillover that happens. And even little interactions, asking your partner about their day all of a sudden doesn't feel very good. Bigger things like going on a vacation, what should be a fun vacation, is no longer fun when you're dealing with this negative spillover. So of course, negativity consumes you. That bubble that you'd merged together with your partner starts to separate. You're avoiding self-disclosure, kind of getting into the second column. And not necessarily purposely trying to keep secrets, but why open up to your partner at that point when it's almost seemed like a threat? And then of course, you're not talking about the fights because it's getting too overwhelming. This being lonely in a relationship starts. So you depend less on one another to get these needs met. And then we move into that third column, the substitution. What is missing? And Carol Russell kind of really breaks this down and calls this the comparison level for alternatives. And really, you're making negative comparisons. So for example, checking out at a grocery store, the cashier asks you how your day, seems genuinely interested, and you think, man, I remember when my spouse used to ask me how my day was and actually seemed interested. Now, when I come home, I'm met with this long list of things that need to happen. There's just not that connection anymore. You become very aware of what's missing, and you're finding that elsewhere. You're confiding in others and not your partner, because that's a hard thing to talk about. And of course, it probably will lead to another fight, kind of going back to that avoidance piece in that second column. A lot of things start to happen here. You're feeling a lot more defensive because you're feeling more of that fight or flight. Criticism increases. It's not my fault, it's theirs. You maybe start complaining to others about how miserable you are in your relationship. Now your story of what you're telling yourself is changing. It's becoming negative. Rather than looking back at those good feelings, we all have these fun beginning of our relationship stories. Now you're kind of going back looking for holes. Oh, there's this one time when we first met when, my partner did this, that should have been a red flag. Contempt is building, resentment is building instead of gratitude. So again, going back to that phase 3 part, we're looking at a culture of appreciation. And when we start to build resentment, it kills that. We start to feel resentment towards our partner and seeing them as selfish. And I would argue selfishness is sort of the opposite of trust. If trust is my partner is interested and cares about me and my welfare, is tuned into that, selfishness is not. It's, it's again, you're in your own bubble at this point. Loneliness builds. Sex probably stops, or at least it's not being used in a way of connecting. You get angry, that narrative becomes even more negative. Now all of a sudden you're not looking at other relationships like a threat, not looking at others like a threat to your relationship. So innocent liaisons may begin. So now, if they were unintentional, now they might be a little bit more intentional. Secrecy, deception increasing, lies start to happen, and then you're just living a parallel life. Now you are in your own bubble, doing your own thing, going to others to meet your needs, not going to your partner to express those needs. And then that's when you can cross a boundary. Deception happens, the relationship is completely vulnerable, and infidelity can occur. So what does this mean? If you are at any part of this cascade, there's a chance to reverse it. And I want to go back to this middle column here, the affection column. It kind of requires a little bit of softness here and vulnerability of having the hard conversations, forcing transparency, even if that leads to a fight. That's a way to start to undo some of this. Being able to say, hey, I'm not getting my basic needs met, attention, affection, approval, none of these are being met. And being able to come up with a way of being able to meet that. You can reverse this. You can merge the bubbles again. So that is the cascade effect. Now I want to talk about what happens when infidelity happens and is revealed. Because now that puts us into trauma world. So again, there's an avoidance with this cascade effect, and you're avoiding having a fight, you're avoiding transparency. So we have a good understanding of what this looks like, but I wanted to just take a second and talk a little bit about trauma. So again, kind of bringing in my my background in this, and I want to kind of just explain it from kind of the DSM definition of it, and then more so what I've seen in my own clinical work, and being able to kind of take a look at this. So trauma really is sort of this ever expanding topic. I think we use this term to talk about the reactions that people have to extreme stress or to a difficult event. And this definition's changed a lot. If you take a look at the last several DSMs, I mean, it's sort of this ever evolving definition. And I think where we are right now with the DSM-5, now in order to diagnose it, we're looking at a number of symptoms. But symptoms really are looking at a life-threatening event or a sexual violation or witnessing one of those. So it has to be something that can really destroy your physical life or part of your physical life, which could be your sexuality. But does our survival only pertain to our body? I'm curious what you think. I think there are some very traditional conceptualizations of trauma. You know, we think of military combat, sexual or physical assaults, car accidents or severe injury, natural disaster. You know, you kind of hear these traditional forms of trauma, but I have to say in my work, you know, working with trauma therapy, that's a minority of what comes in. I see a lot of trauma that's related to kind of more of this interpersonal piece. And so here's just a couple of examples of what I've seen. And I'm sure for, you know, clinicians out there, you could probably add to this list. But I've seen, you know, poverty as traumatic, racial trauma, leaving childhood religion. I think this transgender piece has shown up a lot lately where, you know, you could argue your relationship with your family is intimate and in a different way, like a romantic relationship. And that can get ruptured and lead to kind of a trauma response, kind of this conditional love or affection, attention, approval gets taken away. I think adoption has its own set of trauma. Last couple of years with a pandemic, I mean, almost like a collective trauma of feeling stuck in this situation, not seeing an end to it, really threatening kind of our physical health. And then if you look at this bottom row, these are kind of things that I've seen in relationships, substance abuse or substance abuse being brought into the relationship that starts in a relationship. That can create a trauma response in the partner where they kind of take on this codependent role where they feel like they have to control, especially PTSD if partners using again. Divorce is a big one. I mean, breakups in general, but especially divorce and the legal system, I feel like it's just fraught with all types of trauma. And then we get into the betrayal piece. So does survival only pertain to our body? I would argue it does not. We are looking at our internal world as well as our body, our emotions, values, what we believe to be true, our perceptions of the world. This gives us a sense of comfort in one way or the other. So when we experience an unpredictable event, so it's not something we're anticipating, that can kind of crash through all of that. Our world turns upside down and we start to doubt everything. So I would like to think about PTSD in terms of survival, not only external, but internal, kind of that existential life, which is very socially dependent. And I want to credit Shirley Glass for kind of being the first to discover that affairs can create PTSD symptoms, which makes sense. If you're committed to someone, you're in a loyal relationship, you think that person's committed to you, turns out they're not, unpredictably, look at what's getting influenced. I mean, everything. Your perception of who your partner is, the person you probably trusted the most, your values, your belief in your partner's values, this whole entire life framework that you've created in this relationship, maybe even parenting children together, all of it comes crashing down. And it kind of blows up this internal world. And what do you get? You get PTSD. So I've kind of listed the DSM criteria for PTSD. So moving beyond criterion A, if you look at, you know, B through E, we see that a lot. We see what that ends up looking like with discovering infidelity. We get intrusive thoughts. We get flashes of what we might imagine that betrayal to be. You know, you might not have been there to see what happened, but you are going through every possible imagination of what that looks like. Imagining either the sex that your partner had with someone else or a connection they had. You're getting images coming into your head that are definitely not wanted. They're unexpected. They're out of control. They're jacking up emotions. It feels like flashbacks almost. Nightmares can be really common with this. Hypervigilance is huge. I mean, you are on alert. You are looking for signs of betrayal, feeling like you have to check things much more than ever, alternating between feeling numb and shut down and then having these huge waves of painful emotion, depression spikes, maybe even suicidal thoughts. I mean, again, classic PTSD symptoms. And so what does that mean in terms of addressing the relationship at this point? We have got to treat the trauma first. I think the example I like to use is somebody who comes in with traumatic grief. So somebody who's lost a loved one in a very traumatic way. You can't really access that loss, that grief, if they are in a fight or flight state. If they're having trauma that's hijacking their emotions, it's really hard to process the grief. And I would make the argument, the same thing is true with a traumatized individual in a relationship. You've got to address that first. So before, I think there's this temptation to say, hey, needs weren't being met. What went wrong in this relationship? Why did this happen? You can't have that conversation until you're able to really sit with that trauma and the betrayed partner first. And that means whatever that looks like. Trauma very much is a sense of not having power or control, having choices taken away from you. So really being able to empower that individual again. What do they need at this point? Do they need complete transparency? Do they need space in the relationship? Really trying to figure out where their needs are and coming at it again from a trauma perspective. Just noticing the time. So a lot of PTSD risk factors. Not everybody develops PTSD who's had a traumatic event. I think the thing I wanted to touch on really quickly is one of the biggest determining factors of whether somebody who's experienced trauma develops PTSD is this sort of interpersonal support. So we know that if you have support at the time of the trauma or following the trauma, you're much less likely to develop PTSD. That is not in the DSM. And I don't understand why. And I'm really hoping DSM-6 is going to include that in there. But there's a strong interpersonal piece. So of course, just to go back to this, if your main support system is the cause of that trauma, of course, it's going to be a PTSD response. And then of course, treatment for trauma ends up, any good trauma therapy is really looking at increasing coping skills, getting up the betrayed partner into a place where they can regulate kind of their nervous system again, being able to see with that hypervigilance piece, what's rational, what's irrational, being able to support their physical health, which is usually under that much duress going to be impaired in some way. And then being able to, once you get them stabilized, then doing the trauma work for that. And kind of here's just a quick overview of what good trauma-informed therapy is going to look at. And then you're able to move into the infidelity. Then you're able to take a look at what was going on, going back to that cascade effect. Where did you fall short in those pieces? How can we start to meet those needs again? Attention, affection, approval needs, and being able to kind of move on from there. Okay, sorry to speed up so much there towards the end. Just want to make sure to leave some time for questions. I'm going to try to access the Q&A here. All right, so all right, it's good questions here. So first question is, my daughter's husband cheated on her. Would you recommend that she seek trauma therapy or that they get marriage counseling or both? Yes, that is a good question. I think the thing I love most about the Gottman method is, at least in my understanding, a lot of other couples therapy approaches say, treat the trauma. Go find an individual trauma therapist, do the trauma work, then come back and we'll talk about this infidelity. The Gottman method says, no, this happened in the relationship. This is affecting both partners. We know that social support, and this is, outside of trauma, the likelihood of treatment being beneficial, a lot of that is dependent on what is your social support like. So the Gottman method really says we are treating this together. We're treating the trauma, we're treating the affair that happens, and the partner who had the affair is very much a part of that process. So that would be what I would recommend. Of course, a lot of other couples therapists might send somebody to do individual trauma work and then come back. The question is about porn use. Would you consider porn to be a form of betrayal in the relationship? That is a great question. I think, first of all, differentiating between pornography as an addiction is important, because then it would be looked at a little bit differently. We would treat the addiction kind of piece first and then come back to what that looks like as a betrayal. But absolutely, I mean, every relationship is different. I work with gay couples who have open relationships, meaning they can have sex with other people, but kissing other people is all of a sudden that's breaking kind of their agreed upon terms of the relationship. Same thing with porn. Some people are okay with porn being a part of the relationship. Some people say porn is only something that they want to experience with their partner. Some people don't want porn at all in there. So whatever has been agreed upon, I think the key ingredient here is it being kept secret? Or is there transparency with that? I think a lot of times when people are dealing with the aftermath of a betrayal, it's not just the infidelity, but it's the secrecy that led up to it. And that plays very heavily into that trauma response. Are there any resources my wife and I can use that aren't just couples therapy? Yes, I would hope. I hope that this has been helpful. I have tons of resources. In fact, I have a slide. Let's see it. Got where I pulled through for this presentation. Some really amazing books out there. I'd say the Gottman Institute in general has some amazing resources that aren't just couples therapy. They've got workshops you can attend, retreats. They've got their own webinars, depending on what it is you're looking for. I'm not sure if you're looking for resources for infidelity or for trauma as it shows up, but they kind of cover a lot of that. They've got their 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work book. In fact, there's also a workbook that I recommend that couples can do outside of therapy to kind of speed up that process. Sue Johnson's got some great books out there. Hold Me Tight. She's got some stuff on EFT, attachment theory, that has been really helpful. Kind of looking at this dynamic that tends to get played out in relationships. Again, we kind of look at those earliest relationships and see how that's informed the way that we interact with our partner now. So she does a really good job of kind of connecting those dots. What else? There's a really good transcending post-infidelity stress disorder. So not necessarily a disorder that's in the DSM, but looking at PTSD, you know, in terms of infidelity, by somebody, I can't remember the name, but he kind of goes through 6 stages of healing for that. And I've heard good things from that book as well, some of the couples that I've worked with. Shirley Glass, tons of great books out there. Not Just Friends is really good. People in Glass Houses is really good. Again, kind of where I pull through a lot of looking at that cascade effect for this presentation. It's got some really good things out there. I could talk about books all day long. If you're wanting books on just understanding trauma, I have to recommend Body Keeps the Score. But if you're interested, here's my email. So feel free to email me. I'm happy to type up a list of resources that you could look at for this. Here's a good question. At the point of attempting to repair, what if one partner is willing to engage and have the difficult conversations, but one is not? I think that is a really informative point. Now, I'm curious, is it the partner that's not willing to have the difficult conversation who did the betrayal? I think if it's the partner who did the betrayal, that might be indicative of how good something like couples therapy is going to be. If they're not willing to have difficult conversations, then it's kind of showing, again, kind of going back to that phase 3. Is there loyalty? Is there a willingness to have these difficult conversations? So I think maybe needing to go back all the way to phase 2 and trying to figure out where you fall with that. So it's important. Any experience in relating this to non-monogamous relationships? Yes, of course. I think, you know, I've definitely been speaking to more of the monogamous kind of dyadic relationship with 2 partners. But yeah, anytime you are, again, going back to what is this relationship built upon? What are these agreed upon terms? If you are violating those terms and keeping it from your partner, absolutely, this is relevant. Going through that cascade effect and really trying to figure out where do things go wrong? How can we get these needs met? So yeah, I would definitely say apply that to non-monogamous relationships too. What do you work on in couples therapy once they have processed the trauma individually? Great question. I feel like I could give a whole other presentation talking about what that process ends up looking like. There's kind of there are different stages to move a couple through in terms of looking at complete transparency. At this point, there have been secrets that have been kept. And so we would set aside a lot of time to ask the questions. Let's get everything out on the table, because at this point, we have got to start rebuilding that trust. And trust you can't just do overnight. So we look at ways to do that. And then once we kind of have a good basis, then I'm looking at ways to help them address conflict, because usually there's that sort of negative sentiment override that's happening, where they're feeling like no matter what they do, a fight is just going to, you're not gonna be able to solve a fight. So we're looking at actual tools, ways to address conflict, while looking at ways to rebuild the trust, while looking at ways to strengthen that relationship. I mean, it's marriage number 2. The Gottmans talk about that all the time. When there has been infidelity, that first marriage, that first relationship's over. And so we were really looking at how do we start over? And we're moving through phases 1, 2, and 3. So great question. Happy, I think Gottmans do a great job of kind of breaking that down. But if you're interested, feel free to email me. I can go into more detail of what that looks like in terms of couples therapy. Someone in a relationship considers pornography use as infidelity. Is the therapy the same as what's been discussed today? Yes, absolutely. We've broken what was agreed upon in the relationship, and now we're looking at that kind of avoidance of transparency here. How do you learn to feel safe again with the offending partner if they're trying to change? How does one move past an affair? Yes, again, that kind of goes back to, that's where couples therapy comes in. One of these workbooks, let's see, which one was it? Couples therapy workbook for healing is really good. Kind of looking at that if you're not wanting to go the couples therapy route. But really, you are giving that betrayed partner the power back. You are giving them choices, letting them take effective action. Again, this is any kind of trauma that comes up. If you're treating trauma, that's exactly what you're doing. You're empowering that partner. And that might mean they have access to your social media. That might mean they need extra detail about where you're going at night, who you saw, what kind of interactions you're having. Going above and beyond. And there is no time limit for that. That could be different for so many people. And it is a painful process because you're trying to figure out what that partner needs. Sorry if I'm moving too quickly through this, if I'm not answering these questions, again, here's my email. Please email me. I'm happy to continue this conversation. Can we get a copy of the recording and slides? Camilla, I have a feeling they're going to get the recording. I don't know about the slides. Is that something you can speak to?
Yes, everyone will get a link to the recording via email. And as far as the slides, Dr. Taylor, that's up to you whether or not you'd like me to share that in the same email. But it's up to you.
Yeah, of course. I love that. I worked hard on these slides. So yes, send them out along with the recording.
Okay, awesome.
And recording is available also, after the fact, right? People can come back and register and get access to that. Okay.
Yes, we also have a archived webinars page where you can go back and look at all of our recordings, and that link will also be included on the email tomorrow. So, okay.
I'm seeing so many questions, and there's such good questions, and I know we're out of time. I want to answer all of these. If I didn't get to your question, please send me an email tonight, send me an email this week. I will definitely be making sure I can answer as many of these as possible. Like I said, I'm very passionate about getting this information out there, helping couples who are struggling. You don't have to go the expensive couples therapy route. There are tons of resources out there, so let me connect you to them. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was so amazing. I love the Q&A especially. There's some really great questions in there.
Yeah, there really are. I think I might
Yeah.
look.
So many good ones. And for sure, yeah, feel free to message Dr. Taylor and ask your question if you didn't get it answered today. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending tonight. And we're just so grateful, Dr. Taylor, that you were able to share all this really valuable information with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, everyone have a good night.